the future. Perhaps you've had your palm read or had a tarot card reading, just for fun of course, but then wondered just a little. And what about deja vu, that feeling of certainty as though you've lived through this situation before somehow? Or maybe you've had a dream, an intuition, an instinct that something's going to happen. Have you ever been right? Could you be right? The subject of this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture is another bureau, the Premonition Bureau, and the two men who believed, or hoped, at least for a while, that you could be right. I'm Stephen Kurtz, and I've got a premonition that you'll enjoy this story and many of the others we broadcast here on Soho Radio. You can check them out, and you can join our newsletter where we give our own hints about the future and about future events that we're involved in, such as the wonderful A&Y Literary Festival in June. Thanks to those who've already joined us and who've supported us. Beth, Bill, and Ronnie Lambert, again, who keeps giving me amazing tips. Come and join them. It's all at bureauoflostculture.com. Now, visions of the future, foresight, foretelling, divination and prophecies have populated myth, literature and history. And the notion that time is not linear is even gaining currency in science. The idea that we might be able to influence the future is very attractive now. I mean, who's not fantasised about knowing the results of the lottery in advance? Maybe that's just me. But in the mid-60s, deep in the heart of those countercultural years, when many things seemed possible, when many dreamed of a new world in the future, when the boundaries of consciousness were being explored and pushed forward, when human and scientific achievements were coming thick and fast, two British men, prompted by a terrible disaster, carried out an experiment with time. John Barker, a 42-year-old psychiatrist at Shelton Hospital near Shrewsbury, with a keen interest in unusual mental conditions, was one of them, and Peter Fairley, a British science journalist and broadcaster, was the other. They created the Premonition Bureau, something like a very early English, undramatic version of the pre-crime unit in Philip K. Dick's Minority Report. Their story has been detailed by my guest today, Sam Knight, a writer for the Financial Times, the New York Times, Harper's and Queen, and The Guardian, who now writes rather wonderful long-form stories for the New Yorker magazine. He says he reads a lot and tries to be on time. We talk about all that, about writing, about listening, about the placebo and nocebo effects, about psychic investigations, about the voodoo death phenomenon, and of course, about his wonderful book, The Premonition Bureau. Welcome, Sam.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Sam, it strikes me that you do something which these days is a bit countercultural, which is that you write long-form journalism on subjects that you spend quite a long time researching. And given the fact that we live in a world where, like, we're all grazing these sort of bite-sized pieces of information, that does seem something which is running counter to the culture in some way. Is that right?
It's really interesting. It's a pretty niche occupation in some ways. But I do think that one of the counterintuitive things about the internet and this kind of moment of digital fragmentation or whatever is happening is that there is room for these longer pieces of reporting, and I think that there's a real kinship between podcasting and between what I do. There is an appetite for in-depth thinking and writing and reporting on subjects, which has kind of always been there and will always be there, but it feels like we're in a kind of flux moment in terms of how it reaches us, I think.
It's quite interesting you make that connection with podcasting, because for this show, for me, which is I regard as a kind of way of educating myself and also sort of sharing that, an hour can seem like quite a long time for a conversation, but it's usually actually feels a bit too short. And part of it for me was also to run counter to the way I've gone, which is that I found myself not really been able to read anymore
Yeah.
with any concentration. I'd lost the habit somehow.
Yeah.
My responsibility, but I can pin some of it on the internet,
Yeah.
And I've been re-educating myself in the ability to actually read, but also to listen and to have, extended conversations. And the first thing I saw by you was your essay about Adam Curtis.
Okay.
It was like, oh, right, okay, so people are taking time to really investigate a subject or a person in this case.
I write for The New Yorker now, but for about 5 years I wrote half the time for The Guardian long read. But the long read, I think in really quite a kind of half thought out way, they just asked us, once you'd written something, just to come in and read it out in a studio at The Guardian. And you do that, it would take an hour, and they'd put it out, and they noticed, rather to their surprise, how popular that was. And I don't think it's parity. I don't think as many people listen to The Guardian long read as read them, but it's real numbers. And The New Yorker started doing it a couple of years ago, where the magazine goes to print on a Friday. A group of audio narrators, actors, artists, record over the weekend, and it's there to go on a Monday. And rather like what you're saying, a piece of long form journalism which has been going for 100 years in the New Yorker, they tend to work out at about 40 minutes or an hour of audio, and that works with people's commute or their run or whatever. So there's something happening there.
Yeah, I think we also love to be told stories, don't we?
Yeah.
So there's that. I think we kind of connects into that, and certainly for me, there are books that I know that I will never actually read for various reasons, but I can listen to them. So I recently listened to Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which was terrific.
Yeah.
But I was never going to read it. That's the truth of it. But a long car journey, it was perfect. But let's circle back to you and your book, because the other thing, apart from the actual writing of these, is that you spent time finding stories, finding unusual things to write about, and spending the time actually investigating them. And to talk about the Premonition Bureau, it's a fascinating story, and let's dig into what it actually is for people who don't know about it, and then talk a little bit about how you came across it, and in fact how you wrote it, right? So
the Premonition Bureau is a story of an experiment that took place in the mid-60s in Britain. It was a combined effort of a psychiatrist called John Barker and a journalist called Peter Fairley, who was the science editor of the Evening Standard newspaper. And this was the conceit. The conceit was can we collect the dreams and forebodings and visions of the British public on a kind of sufficient scale that you could use those kind of ill-shaped mainly dreads about the future to sort of generate a warning of some disaster that might be about to occur, to collect instances of kind of precognition on a mass scale, and then feed those into a computer, and then a computer could kind of scan these for sort of similarities, kind of peaks and patterns as he described them, to then kind of generate an official kind of early warning that something bad was about to occur. It's this experiment which is simultaneously completely far-fetched and kind of and kind of bonkers and engaged with the occult and the supernatural, and yet on the other hand, to my mind, it strongly foreshadows social networks and what we do every day in terms of pouring our feelings and instincts and experiences into computers that then trawl those for peaks and patterns to feed us advertising or kind of the next TikTok video. Do you know what I mean? I loved reporting this story and writing this story for the way that it veers between what I see as quite kind of primal human and social needs and something which sounds completely kind of esoteric and kind of, in Barker's case, was ultimately quite dangerous.
To begin with, what is a premonition? I mean, we all kind of know what it is, don't we? But how do we describe it?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. Peter Fairley, who I mentioned was the sort of the journalist and the kind of the popularizer, the kind of front man for the experiment, gave an interview to the BBC in the late 1970s in which he described a premonition as more than a hunch, more than a prediction. It's
Right.
You know that something is going to happen. It's almost the feeling that it's already happened. Like it's the sense of a fact rather than something kind of ominous in your waters. It's knowledge, and it's knowledge that you can't have because the thing hasn't happened yet. It's forbidden knowledge, and it's problematic knowledge because no one's going to believe you, and yet you have this thing that you know. And what do you do with that information? It immediately presents you with a choice. Do you share this? Do you warn people? Do you hold this inside? Do you not tell anybody? Do you hope it goes away? There are instances in the book, I promise, of happy feelings about the future and happy cases of certainty, but often it's something darker than that. There's no getting around it. Yeah.
Many people would recognise the incident where, say, somebody's walked into the room and said, and I saw him there and I knew we were going to get married, or I knew straight away that she was the woman for me. That would be a kind of romantic premonition, right? But in this case, there was something a bit dark in the context of Barker himself.
Yes.
Because the fascinating thing is that he's a scientist, isn't he, really?
Yeah.
He's a psychiatrist. He did write this book on psychic death, which is a sort of a phenomenon which you also talk about. And of course, Fairley was the science correspondent of the Evening Standard. So they were not like batty psychics, were they?
No, that's really important. And that, for me personally, is a strong reason why I followed the thread of the Premonitions Bureau. And what initially sparked my interest in it was seeing that, Barker was the deputy superintendent of a large mental hospital outside Shrewsbury. He published in The Lancet and the American Journal of Medicine on a kind of broad range of questions to do with mental health treatment in the 1960s, which was kind of undergoing, quite rapid reform and change. And Fairley is, was fairly well known in Britain in the second half of the 1960s, and he ultimately presented the moon landings on ITN television. So he was literally commuting between NASA and Baikonur in the USSR, covering the space race, and then coming back to his office on Fleet Street and kind of rifling through the latest slightly sort of nutty letters and telephone calls into the Premonitions Bureau. So he was really at the forefront of the latest scientific development in a somewhat go-getting kind of excited frame of mind. But both of these men had a scientific kind of basis for their inquiry, and they also had something to lose. You referred to it a moment ago in terms of the origins of Barker's concern with premonitions, and I think it's kind of maybe helpful just to explain the context of how he approach the subject. Barker published on a broad variety of subjects, from things like mingling wards on mental hospitals between chronic patients and acute patients. He was really interested in the day-to-day treatment of mental illness, and he was also interested in fringe subjects, of which one was the possibility of people being frightened to death. And this occurred with him, with patients that he treated kind of earlier in his career, that if someone has a fixed idea that they're going to die, does that have a physiological component? Does it hasten that?
Well, that comes back to bite him, of course, later on, as maybe we'll do. It's probably worth just going into, I think you call it the voodoo syndrome?
Yeah, voodoo death.
Here is a sidebar about the phenomenon known as voodoo death. In 1942, American anthropologist Walter Bradford Cannon postulated the idea that fear could affect a person to the point that their physical condition would deteriorate in response to psychological distress. He cited examples of extraordinary deaths in Aboriginal societies, suggesting the fear of supernatural consequences caused the deaths witnessed in the natives. He discussed the example of a Maori woman who learned that the fruit she'd eaten had come from a tabooed place. Less than 24 hours later, she was dead. Another was the example of a young man who'd fallen ill when a local witch doctor had pointed a bone at him, a taboo that meant a curse of death. However, when the perpetrator explained to the young man the whole thing had been a mistake, the young man's health returned instantly. Cannon noted the similarities in each case. The individuals were both members of a society where belief in the supernatural was fiercely upheld, and both had suffered what they believed to be some curse or hex. In such cases of voodoo death, the critical factor is the person's knowledge of the magic spell and the certainty that death will soon follow for anybody who breaks the taboo. This belief is backed up by the behaviour of friends and relatives who treat the hex person as though they are dying. According to Psychology Today, in many cases of voodoo death, the cursed person is overwhelmed by hopelessness to the extent of refusing all food and water. In calendar reports, death typically came within 1 or 2 days of being cursed, so that the cause of death was clearly of psychological origin, rather than the hunger or thirst, which generally take much longer. The phenomena of voodoo death remains controversial and poorly understood. Its relevance to advanced societies is also questionable, but doctors have noticed similar effects, and it's long been known that the mere diagnosis of a terminal illness is capable of shortening life. Psychology Today points to the case of a patient in Nashville, Tennessee, who underwent surgery for cancer of the esophagus. Following the surgery, the patient, who was in his 70s, received bleak news. The liver scan was quite abnormal, suggesting extensive cancerous growths in the entire left lobe. Suspecting terminal cancer, his doctors told him that he had only a few months to live. Following the bad news, his whole purpose was merely to survive until Christmas, that he might celebrate it with his relatives. He made good progress and left the hospital late in October. He was readmitted just after New Year's Day and died within 24 hours. What was remarkable about this case is that he didn't really have terminal cancer. The liver scan had been botched, and the autopsy revealed only a slight node of cancerous tissue couldn't possibly have killed him.
If someone says that you're going to die, is there a possibility that that can actually... Cannon laid out a theory of what he called a kind of sympathetic storm, which is a description of kind of hormones being released in sufficient numbers caused by fear and anxiety that could then overwhelm the bodily organs. And these are now called catecholamines, and they can cause heart attacks, and if you undergo a stressful operation, you'll be given medication to balance this out. So there is a function by which this happens, and then medical researcher called Kurt Richter in the 1950s observed an opposite, which is that people can give up and the body shuts down out of hopelessness. And these are kind of medically observed phenomena. And
nothing mystical necessarily. I mean, this could be adrenal, just that.
There you go. And that corresponds to this thing called the nocebo effect, which is the sort of the lesser known sibling of the placebo effect. Placebo effect is I give you an inert pill and I say, hey, this will probably help your headache, and 10 minutes later you're like, yeah, I do feel a bit better. Yeah, thanks very much. The nocebo effect is exactly the same, most often observed during drug trials. Hey, look, here's this inert sugar pill. Some people report that they feel a little nauseous when they take this. You probably won't. You probably won't. You'll probably be fine. And hey presto, a third of people in the trial will then report feeling nauseous. A useful example is kind of Australian doctors in the 1970s working at a melanoma clinic. Reported that once people were given a diagnosis of cancer, they would die sooner than they actually kind of needed to, because they would give up. They had been given, as it was called then, a death sentence.
And he wrote this book, which is very expensive to get now. It's second-hand, I noticed, but Sudden Death, and got quite a dramatic cover on it.
Yeah.
About this thing. But also, worth sort of adding in there too is that, as well as being a doctor and very concerned with the welfare of the patients, at the hospital, and making some, very compassionate changes to things. He did have a sort of mystical experience as well, didn't he? Is that his father, he said, was an accountant, a precise matter-of-fact man, had supernatural experiences during the First World War, and Barker himself, he'd been ghost hunting at Borley Rectory, which people might know about was meant to be the most haunted vicarage. And he sort of did various things even when he was a student, didn't he? Trying to contact the ghost of John Hunter, the surgeon and stuff. So he did have a sort of interest too, if not a predilection towards the psychic, let's call it that.
He kept a crystal ball on his desk, let's kind of... Barker was just a fascinating person for me to write about. He was a divided person. I don't really want to say a conflicted person, because the two parts of his intellectual preoccupations, they interacted with each other. He was a recognisably, a British intellectual of the mid 20th century. He's born in 1924. His father, as you say, served on the Western Front for 3 years, where he reported having supernatural experiences, which was not terribly uncommon for kind of British soldiers at that time. Barker was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, Britain's foremost, organisation interested in the paranormal. It's minority, but it's a significant minority. You had kind of mass observation surveys in the 40s. About a quarter of the British public believed in the supernatural, and the time in which Barker grew up and then practiced as a doctor. He was at Cambridge studying medicine and then going on ghost hunting trips on the weekend, and throughout the period of establishing the Premonition Bureau, he's in contact with the Society for Psychical Research, which is where he publishes some of his research. He's writing to the former president asking, does he know anything about this house? He hears it might be haunted. He's quite interested in buying it. His wife's not so into it. He's and yet during his day job, he is going to Shelton Hospital, taking the locks off the doors, looking at the prescription of antipsychotic drugs. He's on the right side of kind of progressive change in mental health. He is an enigmatic person.
We know that there are many people who want to believe there is something supernatural going on. There are many people who want to disbelieve, deny that there's anything possible could go on which is outside the explanations of science. And you walk the middle line, don't you? You don't either say, this premonition theory is all true, or neither is it. A lot of rubbish, garbage and stuff. And that's quite an important thing in the book. I suppose the thing which struck me as well, Premonition Bureau began in 1967, and now 1967 is the summer of love, and deep in the heart of what we call the counterculture, coming out of that whole 50s revolution of science, and a sense also of things to be discovered, planets to be conquered, new fields to be opened. And so it was somewhat of its time, wasn't it? Because it's difficult now to imagine it being given any credence at all. And yet then, as you said already, it seemed like a logical extension in some ways of all the other investigations and radical things that were going on. It's something that I've thought about, quite a bit when I was researching the book. Why did this arise at this moment? What were the conditions that made it possible? And the two real flowerings of serious engagement with the paranormal, the occult, the impossible in kind of British culture in the 20th century occurred in the years leading up to and then immediately after the First World War, and then, this period that you're describing in the 60s. And these are both periods of rapid technological change, rapid social change, and, and trauma to some extent. I loved reading about Freud and the occult and telepathy, which he found really, really problematic, because on the one hand he's trying to establish psychoanalysis, a kind of serious science, and so any alliance between spiritualism and psychoanalysis were really problematic for him kind of on a professional basis. And yet in all of his sessions he's trying to kind of obtain a state of telepathy and seeing each, and he's listening out for, and he wrestled with this in a really wonderful way. But the phrase telepathy has the same root as telegram and telephone and this is part of the same period of rapid scientific change. It just seemed like telepathy was just the next one that people would figure out. And I think that Barker and Fairley both thought about premonitions in exactly the same way. Just another mind-body physics problem that we're going to figure out. And I think Barker was very keen to expand psychiatry and to take more account of what people would call the interaction between what you're thinking and your mental health and your physical health. That's pretty current.
That's valid. He wasn't wrong. And in the same way, Fairley saw precognition and telepathy and being able to know things that you can't know as part of how do our brains truly communicate with one another. They both thought that medical research and physical scientific research would answer these questions. I mean, they weren't approaching this from the spiritual domain. Scared to Death, which you've referred to, and Barker he was onto something. This project was a wrong turn, but it wasn't that far wrong. And you've got to make wrong turns if you're going to make progress. Yeah. But it's my sense, it's the early 70s, and in fact, Uri Geller has quite a role to play in the shutdown of psychical research and the paranormal.
Because it's seen as, he turned it into entertainment, and
it went too far. Yeah. It is now a moral obligation on some sense to shut this stuff down, drive it out of our universities and to drive it out of our serious places. Oxford had an Institute of Parapsychology in the 1960s, experiments by Alistair Hardy at the Religious Experiences Unit in Oxford. This was part of reputable inquiry.
In the States too. I mean, there was MK Ultra trying to weaponize psychic powers, and the same in the Soviet Union, right? So it was definitely of its time. Also, we should talk a little bit more about the Bureau itself, because you've got all that background going on, the cultural background. Barker's certainly open to the fact that there are things that we don't understand at the moment. And I think you say premonitions are impossible, but they come true all the time. That's your phrase in the book. And, you think of a forgotten friend and out of the blue they call. We know that, right? Yeah. When I'm getting picked up from the airport, my dog's in the car. Apparently, the dog starts to get excited before they get to the airport. Now, you could say, well, that's because he knows the smell of the airport and associates that with people arriving. Maybe, it's true. And of course, Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance, that there is something which we don't understand yet, possibly. Maybe we will do one day. But they set out to turn this into a useful social tool. Yeah. And it started, of course, with this tragic accident at Aberfan in 1965 or 66, I think
66, October 1966, yeah.
Here is a sidebar about the Aberfan disaster. Jeff Edwards' primary school teacher had just started the day's maths lesson when a rumble sounded in the distance. The next thing I remember was waking up, he later recalled. My right foot was stuck in the radiator and there was water pouring out of it. My desk was pinned against my stomach and a girl's head was on my left shoulder. She was dead. Over the next hours, the then 8-year-old Edwards struggled to breathe as his classmates, trapped under a torrent of liquefied coal waste, cried out around him. With every passing minute, he said, they got quieter and quieter, buried and running out of air. Around 11 a.m, someone spotted a tuft of Edwards' blonde hair amid the rubble. A fireman used a hatchet to free him from beneath his desk and passed him to safety via a human chain. Edwards, the 10th child rescued that morning, would be the last survivor pulled from the debris. In total, the October 21st, 1966 disaster killed 144 people, 116 of whom were students at the Welsh town of Aberfan's Pantglas Junior School. Much like the days that preceded it, the morning of the disaster found Aberfan, a South Wales village home to 8,000 coal miners and their loved ones, blanketed in a wet fog. Several years earlier, the local council had contacted the National Coal Board, which ran the nearby Merthyr Vale colliery mine, to express concerns regarding the spoil tip, a massive pile of accumulated coal waste moved during mining, situated just above the school. The NCB not only ignored these complaints, but implicitly threatened the town's livelihood. Make a fuss and we'll close the mine. At the time of the disaster, the tip in question, number 7, rose 111 feet above ground and contained nearly 300,000 cubic yards of waste. Set atop an underground spring covered by porous sandstone, the heap was precariously placed and, thanks to recent rainy weather, extremely saturated. At 7:30 a.m, workers assigned to the tip discovered that it had started to slide. They were unable to prevent further slippage, and at 9:15 a.m, a glistening black avalanche of liquefied coal waste began hurtling towards the village below.
At the time, Barker was working on his book, Scared to Death, and he heard in the kind of early confused news reports that a boy had escaped from the school unharmed, come home and died of shock. And he, as I sort of mentioned earlier, in this pretty heedless way, just the next morning gets in his car and drives to Aberfan, and kind of arrives on this kind of devastating and frightening scene, because it was still raining heavily and there were kind of lots of fears that the waste was gonna move again. and he arrives at this scene and people, bodies are still being dug out, and he realizes even he can't go kind of house to house trying to find the truth of what happened to this boy, and yet he sticks around and begins to pick up instances of people having inexplicable premonitions that this would happen, and he collects these, and some of them, particularly from two of the children who died, they're terrifying. A boy drawing a picture the night before that seems to depict exactly what happened. A girl trying to resist going to school the day before, saying, I had a dream that the school wasn't there anymore. Something black came down all over it, and being sent to school by her mother and dying. You can go two ways on these things. On the one hand, the Aberfan disaster in retrospect was obvious. These huge, steep hills of coal tailings were being piled up on top of rivers and watercourses without any technical supervision or even care for years and years and years. There had been, 3 similar landslides in the same valley over the previous 20 years, and it was only by sheer luck that people hadn't been killed before. So it was kind of, on the one hand, it was blindingly obvious that something terrible like this was going to occur, and yet it was also completely unthinkable. And so you can look at these premonitions and you say, okay, these are actually kind of rational fears, or they are your dog barking in the car, kind of birds sensing things before earthquakes. So Barker comes there and he collects these premonitions, he calls Fairley, and then Fairley puts out a kind of national call for similar instances. A week later in the Evening Standard, there it is. Did you have a premonition of the Aberfan disaster? Which I think, again, just kind of speaks to the intellectual climate of the time.
This is the Today programme, 5th of January, 1967. Mr. Peter Fairley.
Sort of premonition of yesterday's tragedy. And indeed, this sort of foresight is now being taken a good deal more seriously. For instance, the Evening Standard newspaper in London now has records of more than 70 claims to premonition of the Aberfan disaster. Well, now the paper is to conduct a 12-month experiment in which a team led by their science correspondent, Peter Fairley, with the aid of a consultant psychiatrist, will try and investigate claims to premonition. Mr. Fairley explained the scheme to Ian Baird.
We're asking anyone who has a dream or a vision or an intensely strong feeling of discomfort which seems to involve somebody else, danger to somebody else or to themselves, to ring us at Fleet Street 3000, or alternatively to write to us, and we shall want to know their name and their address and the exact details of their premonition and the date and time at which it occurred. And we shall log this information and look at it very carefully, and we have a small team of investigators who will attempt to corroborate whether the premonition comes true, and at the end of the year we shall see what we've got.
Do you expect to get a lot of premonitions for certain events?
Well, I have a horrible feeling that we shall get a lot of letters and phone calls from cranks and highly imaginative people, but I don't want to put these people off necessarily, because a lot of highly imaginative people are sometimes thought to be the people who genuinely have a gift of premonition. On the other hand, we are hoping that we shall get some quite definable patterns in this, and it may be peaks in it, and we could then use this information to warrant a much more elaborate study, perhaps using a computer.
Supposing you do get 15 people with very, very similar specific premonitions, say of an air crash, would you act on that?
Well, the purpose of this experiment is not actually to give warning this year, but simply to find out whether there is anything in it or not. Clearly, if one had remarkable similarities and a large number of premonitions affecting a specific event, I couldn't possibly stand by and not at least describe to the people involved that I had received this information. On the other hand, as I say, the purpose really is not to give warning this year, but to use the evidence, if there is any evidence, to justify the setting up of a national early warning centre at some future date.
Supposing what you find out does result in people taking premonitions seriously and taking precautions, what happens if it's found that despite their precautions, the disaster, the death, the sinking still happens?
I think the answer to that is that we don't know enough about the mechanism of premonition to be able to say one way or the other. I'm sure that many people have experienced situations where they've had a dream, in which they themselves were running into danger. The danger has still occurred, the disaster has occurred, but they have in fact, because of their dream, changed their own behavior and avoided the disaster. Well, this is an example of how it is, or would seem to be possible, to do something about premonition and genuinely avert the disaster.
They get about 70 good ones, of which about 30 have been witnessed before the disaster occurred.
As in, people had sort of reported, I had this dream or I had this thought. It wasn't post-event.
But nonetheless, it was a collection made after the event. The idea behind the Bureau was like, hey, look, let's do this in an open-ended way. Let's not do this kind of after something that we know has happened. Let's just collect them in an open-ended way and see how many of them come to pass.
And of course, one of the main people in the story from now on is the woman who's, I think she was American actually, wasn't she, originally?
Yeah, Miss Middleton.
Yeah, Kathleen
in the
Lorna
book.
Middleton,
Yeah.
and a sort of dance teacher in North London,
Yeah.
who had a very strong premonition of the Aberfan disaster, and in fact, over the next period of time, becomes one of the main people in the Premonition Bureau. She has these physical reactions, and they're very vivid, right?
So Barker was particularly drawn to a small subset of people who he initially met as a result of the kind of the Aberfan investigation, who had physical symptoms along with their visions. And so these would be headaches, a choking feeling, a feeling of kind of acute depression or nausea or something. And I think this kind of speaks to the doctor in him. Barker's day job is in a mental hospital of about 1,000 people, of whom there are 4 consultants, so 250 of them are on his books, and many of these are kind of acutely mentally ill people receiving no treatment of any kind, no drugs, no psychotherapy, nothing, just kind of marooned in this hospital. And then he's kind of going through these cases, and he's just thinking about this as another form of unusual workings of the human mind, and he's just trying to kind of figure out what's going on here. And then Miss Middleton was a music and dance teacher in Edmonton. She was a sort of a child dancer in Boston around the time of the First World War, and then her family, who were English, kind of lost everything in the Great Depression and returned to London in the 30s to these kind of reduced circumstances in suburbia, and it never quite happened for her, right? But she was this charismatic, larger than life music teacher who would have these visions. She just compared it to, like knowing the answer in a spelling test, or kind of seeing words lit up by light bulbs. She never worked as a psychic. She never kind of sought to make any money out of it, but she became a very regular correspondent with Barker during the course of the experiment.
And of course predicted via her visions, plane crash that happened, right? Along with Alan Hencher, was another one of the Aberfan premonition.
Exactly, yeah. Barker called them percipients. And Miss Middleton and Alan Hencher, who was a kind of switchboard operator at the post office, working, mainly night shifts, became 2 of the most kind of active and seemingly accurate correspondents with the Bureau. And so during the course of 1967, Hencher seemed to predict 2 plane crashes, one in Cyprus, one in Stockport, with fairly uncanny accuracy. Miss Middleton had a kind of memorable vision of astronaut getting in trouble, which kind of coincided with the death of Vladimir Komarov, a Soviet cosmonaut who was the first person to die in space in the spring of 1967. To my mind, their kind of most inexplicable one was seeming to have a kind of joint, clear vision of a train crash in November, where a train came off the tracks on its way into Charing Cross. Miss Middleton, it happened on a Sunday evening. On the Wednesday, she's in her kitchen in Edmonton, and she has a vision of a train crash and the words Charing Cross, and sends that into the Bureau. And Hencher, who would suffer from headaches when he was having a vision, was at work and was taken to the sick bay with a kind of with effectively a migraine at 9:16, which was the time that the train came off the tracks. So that made the front page of the newspapers in London.
If we projected forwards, and if there'd been more of these reports, more of the percipients actually predicting things which happened, and the Bureau had grown and become a recognised thing, that if we just imagine that for a moment, it does come up with a problem, doesn't it? Which is that if enough people have a premonition about, say, a train crash, then do you act on it by saying, okay, well, we're not going to run that train that day? And then, of course, it's difficult to know whether the prediction was accurate or not, because if the train doesn't run, it won't crash. You get into this, I think you call this the Jonah and the whale syndrome, where it's difficult to actually know what use to make of the information, even if the Bureau's work had been validated.
It's a real problem for parapsychologists and people who are kind of really gripped by the trying to explain prophecy and precognition. How can you have knowledge of something if it does not happen? If you imagine kind of time as a kind of fabric which is already kind of stitched, and therefore the future is already decided and waiting to happen, and somehow you get a glimpse of it. If you've averted the thing, if you have unstitched the disaster, there's nothing to see, therefore you can't have a vision. It's a paradox, right? There's no way around it.
They sort of addressed this in Minority Report, didn't they? You can prevent the murder from happening, but you can still prosecute the person who is going to commit the murder, right?
You get tied up in a knot pretty kind of instantly, and Barker was aware of this, but, it comes back to something you said a few minutes ago about people being really keen to believe, or equally being really keen to prove that this is just the random workings of the human mind, and we're all subject to confirmation bias and seeing patterns when there aren't there, and kind of how foolish and random we are. I think Barker's mindset was of an experimentalist. If this didn't work, he was going to do something else. Do you know what I mean?
The pursuit of the knowledge.
Right,
I mean, okay,
exactly.
it may not be useful,
or
let's investigate it anyway.
Let's strike out in this direction and see what occurs. And I think, from my point of view, writing the book, when I came across the first mention of descriptions of the Premonition Bureau, I'm pretty sure it was in this Arthur C. Clarke collection of 20th century strange phenomena. It's presented to you as a couple of paragraphs of something else weird that kind of tells you that your supernatural kind of instincts are correct. And I was much more interested, and remain much more interested, in trying to describe the human experience of being in the experiment and the pursuit, and trying to find out. It's like you describing your dog barking in the car when you arrive at the airport. Let's accept for the fact that that's random or a lucky guess by your dog, but that's not how you emotionally experience it, right? That deepens your love with your dog and your dog's love for you, and that's real. Do you know what I mean? So even if the happening is just the random workings of our minds and our bodies, the human experience, how you interpret that and how it then influences how you live and how you feel, is real, right? So this group of people involved in the Premonition Bureau, no doubt prompted by confirmation bias and all sorts, and in the case of some of the people involved, certainly, there are shades of, let's call it kind of neurodivergency or creative forms of madness. That's definitely happening here. But what emerges is a group of people who became convinced that they could see the future. And that leads to a really interesting kind of state of mind, and for some of them, real consequences in their lives. It was that I wanted to write about, rather than, how does time work?
Yeah, and Miss Middleton is interesting from that point of view, because she also predicts, if that's the word, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. She'd been having the premonitions for months, right? And she wrote to Barker saying, Robert Kennedy, an assassination, didn't she? You could say, yeah, lucky guess. I was kind of, right, fair enough, maybe. But the interesting thing about her is that you've already said, is that she never sought to exploit. You could have done, right? She could have set up as a psychic and, charge people. She never did that. So she's very interesting from that point of view. I wanted to just also, in terms of what you're talking about, Barker's interest was the experiment, the furthering of knowledge. My friend Gary Lackman has just published a book on precognitive dreaming, and Gary himself actually has always experienced precognitive dreams. Whenever he talks about it, he's always asked, well, could you have a precognitive dream about the Grand National or even something very useful about the world, right? And he says, no, there's nothing utilitarian in the dreams themselves. You just have a dream about something which is going to happen. So he has a dream, and it might be a dream he's in his kitchen cutting a lemon and his mother rings, and then the next day that happens. It's not useful.
Yeah.
You can't do anything with it.
But
it is a phenomenon that seems to happen.
Yeah.
And that in itself is kind of interesting, because it does ask questions about time and consciousness. Your interest, though, was in the people, wasn't it? And so let's talk about what happened.
So the Bureau, got going in January 1967. In the spring, they have first really kind of significant kind of hit in their terms, which is when Alan Hencher seems to predict this plane crash in Cyprus. He predicted that 123 or 124 people would die in a plane crash, over mountains, lights flashing, and then, 3 weeks later, 124 people die in a plane crash in Nicosia in Cyprus. And the connection seems strong to the people in the Bureau, so they're kind of excited. They feel like it's up and running. And then Hencher calls Barker in the middle of the night at 1 o'clock in the morning and says, "Look, I have a terrible feeling about you. I'm worried about your safety. I think, And Barker says, "Do you think I'm going to die?" And Hencher says, "Yeah, I think you are." And he warns Barker that his life is in danger. And so, if you're John Barker, you're handing in, the manuscript of Scared to Death, this book precisely about the phenomenon of being told you're going to die, and you're running a Premonitions Bureau, and you're kind of one of your star recipients has just given you exactly this warning. And Hencher continues these warnings, and then Middleton joins him, and she also has dreams about Barker, and so he becomes the experiment kind of closes in on him. When I read about this and then came across kind of an amazing memo that Barker himself wrote about this experience, that's when I knew I wanted to write the book. This very peculiar and kind of sinister kind of turning in of the subject on the researcher, I just thought was a really fascinating and sort of state of mind to find yourself in. And Barker was aware of it. Barker wasn't a cold, distanced, uptight kind of British person, which he could have been, but it's kind of clear from his writing and his letters and his correspondence that he was kind of emotionally engaged with what was
and
with
questioning
what was
it as well, wasn't he? Questioning is, am I basically subject to this nocebo sudden death effect?
He was scared, but he was also excited. He was like, "Where's this
going?
Where's this going?" Exactly.
On the day, August 18th, 1968, Middleton finds herself awake in the early hours. She's choking and gasping for breath, calls out for help. And that's the day that he suffers a brain hemorrhage at home in Yockleton. And he died later that day.
Yeah, the day-to-day chronology is a tiny bit more complicated. He suffered the hemorrhage on the Sunday, and Middleton has this experience, and she didn't know at dawn 2 days later, and that's the day he died in hospital, yeah.
Sam, why don't we talk a little bit about how you came to write it, and in fact, the process, because that involved research. Barker's family, right?
I worked on this story for 3 or 4 years, just kind of chipping away and kind of stealing a day or two here to go to the archives of Sheldon Hospital in Shropshire, or to order up old copies of the electoral rolls, trying to trace people who were involved in the Bureau. For instance, there's an amazing woman called Jennifer Preston, who was Fairley's assistant at the Evening Standard, and she was the person who kind of collected the premonitions and sorted them into different categories. She was the custodian, if you like, of the actual the filing cabinets, the sort of the machinery of the Bureau, if you like. And so trying to, the book is built on the survival of cardboard boxes of letters and bits and bobs in people's attics, and that was just a pretty painstaking process to go through. But there were some really fortunate leads in that. One of which was a very, very wonderful woman called Christine Williams, who was a pupil of Miss Middleton, the music teacher. Miss Middleton kind of aged. Christine cared for her, and then when she died, cleared her house, lovingly sorted out all of her possessions and records. So, amazing photographs and memos and poems and a memoir that Miss Middleton wrote that was kind of key to my reporting. And then, as you say, Barker's children, he had 4 children, and that was a really slow and kind of patient process on both sides as we got to know each other. And they ultimately, and I'll always be extremely grateful to them, entrusted me with, many of his kind of writings and letters and things like that, which gave me, as much insight as I could have to write the book.
But it was quite a surprise to them, wasn't it? Because in a way, a strange thing is that you were telling them the story of their own father, which was not the story which they knew about.
Yeah, so I first wrote a kind of article version of the book in the New Yorker, which came out in early 2019, and when I was working on that, I'd made some really good discoveries in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research. I've been in contact with Christine, like I just described, but the Barker family, as I would do in their situation 10 times out of 10, they didn't know what to do with me. This was 50 years ago. They did not really know the details of their father's scientific research, and this kind of strange, totally like anonymous writer was turning up on the doorstep trying to find out everything I could. And they weren't mean to me or hostile. They were just like, do your thing, but we're not going to be part of it. And then when the article appeared, they learned a lot. I think that they could see that I was trying to sort of write about him in a kind of respectful and careful way, and that, as I said, kind of led to this process of us meeting and getting to know each other. And I likewise made contact with Peter Felly's children, and yeah, there was an amazing moment where all of Barker's family and Fairley's family and Christine and some other people who've been involved at the Evening Standard at that time were kind of all gathered in together, and it was a great moment.
It's a very sympathetic portrait of them both. I mean, and also fascinating, but also because it brings his work back into the light. Thanks, Sam. I mean, just to ask you a couple of questions, though, is that do you have any premonitions?
I don't. I mean, as I said a minute ago, it was really the story of a scientist or a researcher getting in too deep. To me, was just an irresistible human subject to try and follow and to explore and to learn as much as I could about, and likewise these settings of a dilapidated mental hospital in the throes of reform, Fleet Street during the summer of love, the world and the kind of characters in the world. I just wanted to know everything I kind of possibly could about them, and to write about it as accurately as I could. And I think, I'm a magazine writer, that's what I do, and it became increasingly important to me to try and write this fairly eccentric story as straight as I could. And just like I'd write about any other thing, I write about politics and sport and science and all sorts of things. And I just wanted to approach this the same way that I would anything else, and to allow it to exist on its own terms without my intellectual agenda.
What's next for you?
I've almost kind of caught up with my obligations at the New Yorker, and I'm really keen to write another book. I'm kind of hoping to create a bit of space this year to find out what that might be.
You've not had any premonitions about it, I'm assuming?
No, that would be handy. I wouldn't say no.
Sam, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you for having me. A real pleasure.
So, listener, what about you? Have you had any premonitions, precognitive dreams, intuitions that came true? Is time a line or a circle or a spiral or something completely different? We live in such radical, changing times that it wouldn't really be surprising, would it, if we suddenly found out that there is some basis to our premonitions, even that time travel is possible. I was once on a plane from Kansas to New York. The plane was absolutely full, and it was delayed several times, first of all by an unruly passenger, then by somebody claiming that the pilot was drunk, and then by some mechanical failure. This was at a time when, due to 9/11 and terrorism and stuff, everybody was a bit edgy, and everybody on the plane was getting increasingly edgy, including me. I happened to be sitting next to somebody called Jeffrey Wands, a TV psychic. Now, I really don't believe in all that stuff, or believe that I don't believe in all that stuff. But he took a phone call from his wife, and his wife was saying to him, "Get off the plane, there's something wrong about this situation." But he said to her, "Look, I'm a psychic. I would know if something was going to happen, and this plane is absolutely safe. Our flight going to be without problems." Well, guess what? I was relieved to hear it, and for that moment at least, I decided to believe in his abilities and his powers to predict the future. I have also carried out extensive research into a reputed time machine in Brompton Cemetery here in London. I'll put a link to that along with a link to Sam's book in the show notes. But as I said earlier, in our own future we'll be at the Hay Festival in June with 3 events about the past and the future of counterculture. Come and join us. I've got a premonition that you'll really enjoy it. Thanks for listening. We're going to play out with our usual sponsor, The Real Tuesday World. This is a track from their future album, Junk Shop Melodies. See you next time.